The ambassador from the Vreth Dominion arrived at Lunar Station Kepler 9 at 400 hours, Earth Standard Time, and the first thing she noticed was that the station was playing music. Not military broadcasts, not emergency protocols, not the kind of tight, compressed communications she had studied during the 6-month transit from Vreth Prime, those careful, measured transmissions humanity had been sending into the void for decades. Music. Something instrumental, low and patient, drifting through the docking corridor like it had always been there, like it belonged. Ambassador Velshara paused at the threshold, her secondary sensory organs processing the sound, and found she had no referential category for what she was experiencing. It wasn't a signal. It wasn't communication. It seemed to exist purely for itself. She filed the observation away and stepped inside. The human representative waiting for her was not what she expected. The Dominion's intelligence division had prepared her extensively. She had studied thousands of hours of human communication, human posture, human negotiation patterns. She had reviewed the Dominion's threat assessment, a document that had been produced by 47 senior analysts over 3 years, and which concluded, with high statistical confidence, that humanity would respond to an ultimatum the way every other pre-expansion civilization had responded, with either immediate capitulation or with terrified, disorganized defiance. The man standing at the end of the corridor was holding a cup of something hot. Steam curled from it. He was watching her approach with an expression she could not immediately classify, and the intelligence files had warned her that human facial expressions were unusually variable, but this one seemed almost amused, not the performative confidence of a species trying to hide fear, something quieter than that, something that made her slow her pace without understanding why. "Ambassador Velshara," he said, "I'm Director Yusuf Marin. Welcome to Kepler 9. He extended the hand not holding the cup, a gesture she recognized from study as one of greeting, of offered peace. "I imagine the transit was long. 53 of your days," she said. "I'll have something warm sent to your quarters." He paused, then added, "We've been told Vreth physiology tolerates liquids at around 80 degrees Celsius. We've prepared several options." She processed this. The Dominion had not shared Vreth physiological data with Earth. The files were classified. Tier 4 restricted. The fact that humanity knew suggested either a significant intelligence breach within Dominion infrastructure or something considerably more disturbing. She did not ask him about it. She decided in that moment that she needed to understand what she was walking into before she began asking questions, because the music was still playing, and Director Marin was still slightly smiling. And outside, somewhere beyond the steel and glass of this station, Earth rotated through the dark like it always had, unhurried, enormous, completely unconcerned. The Dominion had delivered the ultimatum 4 months ago. It had been a masterwork of diplomatic pressure, refined over centuries of successful coercion. The Vreth Dominion controlled 43 systems. They had brought 11 civilizations into compliance using variations of this exact framework. The document was 200,000 words of precisely calibrated threat, structured around 3 pillars: military capacity disclosure, resource demand, and a compliance timeline. 11 civilizations had read it and folded, most within a single planetary rotation. 2 had attempted resistance and been reduced to cautionary examples that the Dominion still referenced in first contact briefings. Earth's response had arrived in 17 days. It was 847 words. Velshara had read it so many times she had committed it to memory, which was unusual for her because she had not intended to memorize it. It had simply lodged itself in her cognition the way certain sounds did, the way damage did. The response did not acknowledge the military capacity disclosure demand. It did not address the resource demand at all. It did not propose a counteroffer, a delay, a negotiating position, or a request for clarification. What it said, in the calm, unadorned language of a species apparently unconcerned with the weight of what it was saying, was that Earth would be happy to host representatives of the Dominion for direct conversation, that Lunar Station Kepler 9 had been prepared for this purpose, and that humanity looked forward to building a framework of mutual understanding. 47 analysts had studied that response for 3 weeks. The consensus was that it was a delay tactic, that humanity needed time to marshal resources, to prepare defenses, to contact other civilizations for potential alliance. The consensus was that Earth was afraid and disguising it with procedural language. The consensus was wrong. Velshara was beginning to understand that, standing in this corridor with the music still playing, watching director Marin sip from his cup. She just didn't know yet how wrong. The first formal session began the following morning, though morning was a human construct that required the station's environmental systems to shift the lighting on a 24-hour cycle, creating an artificial day that the human staff seemed to genuinely need. Velshara found this biologically peculiar, but had been advised by her preparation team not to comment on it. She had brought 3 advisors. Marin had brought 2, a woman named Dr. Alara Vasquez, who was introduced as a behavioral scientist, and a man named Commander Roe Park, who was introduced simply as from the Oversight Division, which meant nothing to Velshara and everything to the 2 Vreth intelligence analysts seated behind her. There was a 4th chair at the human side of the table. It was empty. Velshara noted it, did not ask. Marin opened by thanking her for making the transit, which she recognized as a social ritual, and then by asking whether she had slept well, which she also recognized as a social ritual, and then he set down a physical document on the table, printed on actual paper, and slid it toward her side. She looked at it. It was a single page. In the center of the page was a question. What does the Dominion actually want? She stared at the question for several seconds. Then she looked up at Marin. We transmitted a detailed ultimatum, she said, 200,000 words. Yes, Marin said. We read it carefully. He paused. All of it several times. Another pause. We had some questions. Such as what you actually want. He gestured to the paper. The document is extremely thorough on what you're demanding. It's less clear on why. And in our experience, and here he glanced briefly at Dr. Vasquez, who was writing something, knowing the why is where real conversations start. Velshara had a prepared response to 14 different opening negotiating positions. She had not prepared a response to this one. She managed to say, carefully, the Dominion's motivations are established by the document's framework. Sure, Marin said, which was a human affirmation that her translation software flagged as potentially insincere. But frameworks are what people build when they're not quite ready to talk about the thing underneath the framework. So, he leaned back. What's the thing underneath? That night, in the encrypted channel back to Vreth Prime, Velshara reported that the negotiations were proceeding as expected and that humanity was employing delay tactics. She was not lying. She genuinely believed that. What she did not include in her report was the empty chair, because she did not yet understand what it meant, and she had learned, in 30 years of diplomacy, that the things you cannot yet explain are rarely nothing. The second session was where the first real fracture appeared in her understanding. Marin arrived 4 minutes late, which he apologized for without elaboration. He was accompanied by Vasquez and Park, and this time, by a woman in a civilian suit who was introduced as Minister Adiz Obi, joining us from Geneva. The empty chair was filled. Velshara made a note of it and then immediately wondered whether the arrival of Obi had been staged for her to observe, and then immediately wondered whether her wondering had been anticipated. The session concerned, ostensibly, the resource demand in the Dominion's ultimatum. Specifically, the extraction rights to 12 ocean floor mineral deposits that Dominion surveys had identified as critical to a particular class of drive technology. Velshara had prepared to negotiate these down to 8 deposits. This was standard practice. She had a minimum position of 6 deposits, below which the mission parameters required her to break off talks and signal the fleet. The fleet was 47 days out. It had been dispatched the same week as the ultimatum, which was standard practice. By the time negotiations failed, as they generally did, the fleet would be in position. Marin listened to her open with the resource framework. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual, and Velshara's preparation materials had specifically noted that humans tended to interrupt in high-stakes conversations because they processed emotional responses quickly and had difficulty containing them. Marin contained his. He let her finish. Then he asked Dr. Vasquez to share something. Vasquez opened a small projection and showed a geological survey. Velshara recognized the data. It was substantially similar to the Dominion's own survey of Earth's ocean floor deposits. "This is our survey," Vasquez said. "We did it about 18 months ago when we first became aware that the Dominion was conducting surveys of our system." She let that sit for a moment. The implication that Earth had known about the surveys before the ultimatum arrived settled into the room like a slow weight. "The 12 deposits you've identified represent approximately 34% of our accessible reserves of these minerals, which is a significant ask." She clicked to the next slide. "This is our current production capacity, and this," she clicked again, "is what that capacity is being used for." The third slide showed an infrastructure map. Velshara processed it. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing, and then it took her another moment to believe it. The mineral extraction was already underway, had been underway for over a year. The materials weren't being stockpiled or sold. They were being used rapidly for something that didn't match any of humanity's known infrastructure projects. "What is this?" she asked. Vasquez looked at Marin. Marin looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at Velshara with that same expression she couldn't quite classify. "Something we started building when we got the survey results," he said, "before the ultimatum." "What are you building?" "That," Marin said, "is probably the more interesting conversation." He didn't answer the question. The session ended 20 minutes later on a discussion of procedural timelines that Velshara could tell were meaningless to everyone in the room. She returned to her quarters and found that the liquids prepared for her were at precisely 80 degrees Celsius and that someone had placed, on the small table by her resting alcove, a physical book. A human book, printed, its cover showing a painting of ocean water. Inside the front cover, in handwritten human script, someone had written, "For understanding the parts that don't translate." She didn't sleep that night. She wasn't sure humans had intended her to. The communication she received from Vreth Prime on the 19th day of negotiations was marked urgent, which was unusual, because urgent communications from the Dominion during active negotiations were a procedural escalation she had only experienced once before, 14 years ago, when a civilization called the Orcs had attempted to arm themselves during talks. The Orcs were now a Dominion protectorate. They had 17 remaining cities. Velshara opened the communication and read it, and then read it again, and then sat with it for a long time while the station's artificial lighting moved from night toward morning around her. The Dominion fleet had detected something on its approach. Not a human fleet. There was no human fleet. That much the analysts had confirmed, because the absence of a defense mobilization had been one of the most confusing elements of Earth's response from the beginning. In the 47 days since the fleet's dispatch, Earth had not scrambled ships, had not moved military assets, had not contacted neighboring civilizations for alliance or support. The complete absence of military preparation had been interpreted, consistently, as evidence of fear, as a species paralyzed by the gap between its own capabilities and the Dominion's. What the fleet had detected was not a military asset. It was a network. A distributed array of objects, small, individually unremarkable, positioned across an enormous volume of space, in a configuration the Dominion's tactical analysts had never encountered before. The Fleet Science Division had spent 6 days analyzing it before concluding that it was, probably, some kind of communication relay. Long range. Far longer range than anything Earth should theoretically be capable of constructing. The range of the relay extended well beyond the edges of the Dominion. Velshara read the communication 3 more times. Then she did something she had never done in 30 years of diplomatic service. She knocked on Director Marin's door at 3:17 hours. He answered in clothing she recognized as sleepwear, holding, somehow, another cup of something hot. His eyes were slightly unfocused in the way her research had categorized as post-sleep cognitive reorientation, and yet he didn't seem surprised to see her, which was either a remarkable feat of composure or evidence of something she didn't want to think about yet. "Ambassador," he said. "The relay network," she said. Something moved across his face. She still couldn't classify it. "Come in," he said. "I'll make you something warm." What Marin told her over the following 2 hours did not make things clearer. This, she would later understand, was intentional, not as deception but as the most honest thing he could have done. The truth, when you tried to compress it into a form another species could absorb in 2 hours, tended to become a different and lesser thing than the truth actually was. The network, he explained, had been built in response to a problem that predated the Dominion's ultimatum by nearly 40 years. Earth had been aware for 4 decades that its position in the galaxy was vulnerable, not primarily militarily, though that was part of it, vulnerable in a deeper way, a way that had to do with isolation, with the fact that a species alone, whatever its capabilities, could be surrounded, pressured, picked apart. The network was a message, or more accurately, the network was the infrastructure for delivering messages that had been in transit for decades. Messages to civilizations far outside the Dominion's reach, and not military communiques, not alliance proposals, not the kind of communication that a species building toward conflict sends out. Stories, Velshara thought as Marin talked. They were sending stories. "What kind of stories?" she asked. "Ours," he said simply. She let that sit. "Then, why?" He looked at his cup for a moment, then at her. "Because we figured out a long time ago that a civilization that destroys you becomes a story. And we've learned that stories have a reach that fleets don't." She returned to her quarters before the station's morning cycle began and sent an encrypted communication to Vreth Prime that was far longer than her usual reports. In it, she did not downplay what she had learned. She had been a diplomat long enough to know when the framework of a mission had fundamentally shifted. The fleet, she recommended, should hold position. The response came back in 11 hours. The fleet would hold for 30 days. After 30 days, regardless of negotiating progress, it would advance. 29 days, Velshara thought. She had 29 days to understand something that she suspected had taken humanity 40 years to build. The conversation that broke something open in her happened not in a formal session, but in a corridor between sessions, when she encountered Dr. Vasquez walking from one end of the station to the other with a stack of physical files under one arm, and an expression of concentrated thought that dissolved into ordinary friendliness when she noticed Velshara. "Ambassador," Vasquez said, "do you have a moment?" They walked together. Vasquez seemed comfortable with silence in a way that Velshara had not seen often in humans, who generally seemed to experience silence as a deficit to be filled. After perhaps 90 seconds, Vasquez said, "Can I ask you something off record?" "Off record is not a concept with clear bounds in my role." "Fair." Vasquez shifted the files. "Then on whatever record you'd like, I'm curious about something. The Dominion has done this before, 11 times. You bring in the ultimatum, you send the fleet, the civilization folds or gets reduced. That is a simplified characterization. Probably, but here's what I'm curious about." Vasquez stopped walking. They were at a viewport. Outside, Earth hung in the dark, one edge lit by the sun, the rest in shadow, the shadow thick and blue-black and full of implied depth. After 11 times, did anyone ever ask why they kept working? The civilizations that didn't fold. The ones that became the cautionary examples. Did anyone ever study what they were actually trying to do, what they thought they were accomplishing? Velshara looked at her. They were trying to survive. Sure. Vasquez turned from the viewport. But they also knew they probably couldn't. They knew the math, the Dominion's military capacity versus theirs. They knew the odds. She paused. And they kept going anyway. Don't you find that strange or interesting, or at least worth asking about? The question lodged in Velshara the way the 847-word response had, the way the music had, the way the empty chair had. The analysis concluded it was irrational, she said. "Yeah," Vasquez said. She picked up her files again. "That's the part I think you might have gotten wrong." On the 21st day, the revelation arrived that Velshara would, for the rest of her career, identify as the moment the mission became something other than what it had been. It came in the form of a data packet transmitted to the Dominion fleet by Commander Roe Park, which was itself strange because Park had barely spoken in 21 days of sessions and was not officially a transmissions officer. The packet was flagged in her morning communications summary as anomalous, and when she asked Marin about it directly in the open session, he did not hesitate. "Commander Park sent the fleet our structural survey of the Carrack system," Marin said. "We thought it might be useful to the fleet's navigation division." Velshara processed this. The Carrack system was 3 weeks from the fleet's current position, in the direction of Earth. It had been surveyed by Dominion assets 7 years ago, and the survey had been classified, because within the Carrack system there was a navigational anomaly, a dense debris field from a collapsed stellar body that represented a significant hazard for capital ship navigation. The Dominion's classified charts routed the fleet around it, adding 11 days to any approach vector toward Earth. The human survey was more detailed than the Dominion's. It included approach corridors through the field that the Dominion survey had marked as impassable, corridors that, according to the human data, were navigable with appropriate precaution. The fleet could use those corridors to cut 11 days from its approach. The human survey was, functionally, a gift. Or Velshara thought very slowly, very carefully, as she sat in the session and watched Marin watch her process this. It was something else entirely. Because the fleet could use those corridors. That was true. But the human survey had been transmitted to the fleet's navigation division, which meant it had gone through standard channels, which meant it would be reviewed, which meant the fleet's science division would analyze it, which meant they would discover something that Velshara was now rapidly concluding humanity had discovered before they transmitted it. The corridors were navigable. They were also the most comprehensively surveyed corridors humanity had ever mapped in that system, surveyed in detail, including the locations of every significant object in the debris field, including the resonance frequencies of the debris field's densest clusters, including, she was now certain, information that a sufficiently motivated species that had been thinking about this problem for considerably longer than the Dominion could use in ways that a fleet moving through a debris field, trusting a foreign survey, would have absolutely no warning about. She looked at Marin. He looked back. "How thoughtful," she said very carefully. "We try," he said. Later, alone, she spent 3 hours reanalyzing everything she thought she had understood about the past 21 days and found that nearly all of it needed to be reframed. The music in the corridor, the 847-word response, the empty chair, the book on her table, the questions that answered themselves with larger questions, the physiological data that humanity wasn't supposed to have. None of it was delay. None of it had ever been delay. She sent a communication to Vreth Prime that night and requested that the fleet maintain its current position. The communication was 12 words. She did not explain the debris field. She did not explain the corridors. She simply requested that the fleet hold. Vreth Prime responded in 9 hours. The fleet would hold for an additional 14 days. Velshara looked at that number. 14 days. And then she did something she had not done since she was very young, since before diplomacy, since before the Dominion, since before she understood what the galaxy expected of everyone in it. She sat with the uncertainty. She let it be large. She stopped trying to resolve it. Director Marin found her at the viewport the next morning. He didn't knock on the glass or announce himself. He just came and stood beside her with his cup, watching Earth turn. "You sent something to your fleet," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. "Did you tell them about the survey?" She considered the question for a longer time than it probably warranted. "No." He nodded slowly. She watched his reflection in the viewport rather than turning to look at him directly. He seemed, to her now considerably recalibrated perception, like someone who was tired, not operationally tired, tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. She had seen that particular quality in exactly 2 other people in her career. Both of them had been negotiating something that mattered to them more than winning. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "That is genuinely off record." "Sure." "The relay network, the stories you're sending." She paused. "You know the Dominion will eventually encounter whatever response comes back, if any comes back, if anything comes back in time to matter." "Yes." "Then you know there's a real probability that it doesn't help, that the fleet comes, that the conversations fail, That the stories you've been sending for 40 years are still in transit when everything else ends. Marin looked at his cup, then at Earth, then back at his cup. Yeah, he said. Why, she asked very quietly, would you do that, any of it? The network, the preparation, the conversations, if the probability of survival is low enough that you acknowledge it. Why keep building something you might not live to use? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, my grandmother was a doctor. Not a good time in human history to be a doctor the years she worked. Not enough of anything. Not enough medicine. Not enough equipment. Not enough time. He didn't look away from Earth. She used to say that the point of caring for someone was never about the odds. The point was that the person in front of you needed someone to act like they mattered. Even when the math said otherwise, especially then. Velshara stood with that. The station hummed around them. Somewhere the music was playing again. You are trying to make the galaxy act like you matter, she said finally. We're trying to make ourselves worth mattering too, Marin said. There's a difference. She turned that distinction over carefully, and she felt, for the first time since arriving at Lunar Station Kepler 9, something that her species categorized as a shifting of foundational assumptions. Not a small adjustment, not a recalibration. The kind of shift that, once it happened, made the world before the shift feel like a simpler place you could not return to. On the 28th day, with 1 day remaining before the Dominion's internal deadline, something happened that no one in the Dominion's 47 analyst team had modeled, predicted, or considered possible. The civilizations the relay network had been reaching for decades began responding, not with military support, not with alliance declarations, not with anything the Dominion's frameworks for analyzing existential risk had a category for. The responses were stories, transmitted back through the relay, stories about their own histories, their own survival, the moments when they had been alone and been found, not by armies, but by the knowledge that something else in the dark had cared about the answer. Velshara received a summary of the transmissions in a data package from her intelligence division, who had intercepted them with evident confusion and flagged them as potentially coded military communications requiring analysis. She read the analysis. Then she read several of the original transmissions. They were not coded. They were exactly what they appeared to be. Civilizations across a range that exceeded the Dominion's own had read Earth stories and were sending their own back, and in doing so were doing something that 47 analysts had not modeled because there was no established framework for it. They were choosing to know humanity. They were choosing to be known in return. The Dominion had 11 cautionary examples. Earth was apparently building something that didn't have a name in Vreth political science yet. Velshara spent 4 hours composing a communication to Vreth Prime. It was the longest communication she had ever sent. When she finished it, she sat with her hands on the terminal for a long time, not transmitting, just sitting. Then she added 1 paragraph at the end. She transmitted it. On the 29th day, in the final formal session, Marin arrived with Vasquez and Park and Minister Obi, and this time there were 2 empty chairs on the human side of the table, and Velshara almost asked but stopped herself, because she had finally begun to understand that the empty chairs were not absences. They were space, deliberately held open, for something not yet arrived. She set her prepared framework on the table and then, after a moment, folded it and set it aside. Marin watched her do this with the expression she could now finally classify. It was not amusement, it was not performance. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to find out what another person would do when the frameworks ran out and was now, quietly, deeply relieved by the answer. The fleet will hold, Velshara said, indefinitely. The room was very quiet. That's not within your mission parameters, Marin said. No, he nodded. He seemed to understand. He looked briefly at the empty chairs and then back at her and said, the Vreth Dominion won't just accept that. No, she agreed. They won't, she paused. They will want an explanation. They will want to know what changed. What will you tell them? Velshara considered this for a long time. Outside, Earth turned. The music played its patient, purposeless song through the corridors of Lunar Station Kepler 9. Somewhere, traveling at the speed of light through the dark between stars, 40 years of stories were still moving outward. still finding their way toward civilizations that didn't yet know a small, isolated, biologically unremarkable species had decided, without any guarantee of it mattering, to spend 4 decades telling the rest of the galaxy what it was like to be human. "I will tell them," she said slowly, "that I encountered a civilization that should have been afraid and was not, and that I spent 29 days trying to understand why, and that I failed because I was using the wrong question." She stopped. She looked at Marin. "The right question is not why they aren't afraid. The right question is what they are instead." "And," Marin said quietly. Velshara thought about her grandmother she didn't have, about the surgeon who operated on patients the odds had already given up, about the debris field full of carefully catalogued stones that a fleet might or might not ever move through, about 40 years of messages in transit toward civilizations that might or might not ever respond, about 847 words that said nothing except "come and talk to us" and meant everything except surrender. "Patient," she said. "They are patient. In a way I don't have a word for. Patient not because they believe things will improve, but because they have decided without evidence that the effort is worth making." She paused once more. "The Dominion has never encountered a species that separated those two things, hope from action. They have always assumed that a species only acts when it believes it will succeed. And humanity," she said, "appears to act specifically when it isn't sure that it will, as though the uncertainty is the point. As though doing the thing when you cannot guarantee the outcome is what makes the thing worth doing." Marin put down his cup. "Yeah," he said, very quietly, "that's about right." The Vreth Dominion recalled the fleet 14 months later. The official diplomatic record cited procedural factors, renegotiated frameworks, mutual interest agreements. The unofficial record, the one Velshara wrote for internal review, and which was subsequently classified at a tier, usually reserved for existential threats, described what had actually happened in considerably less comfortable terms. She described 29 days on Lunar Station Kepler 9. She described music in a docking corridor, and a cup of warm liquid, and a room where empty chairs were held open for things not yet arrived. She described a relay network that no one had ordered built, and no fleet could destroy because it wasn't a weapon. It was an invitation, distributed across so much of the galaxy's volume that dismantling it would take longer than the Dominion's current strategic horizon could account for. She described the responses still arriving, month after month, from civilizations no one had thought to reach, carrying stories no intelligence division had known to intercept. And at the end of the document, in a section she marked simply as personal observation, and therefore not subject to standard analytical review, she wrote something that she knew would make her colleagues uncomfortable, that she wrote anyway because 30 years of diplomacy had taught her that the things that made you uncomfortable were almost always the things that mattered most. She wrote, "The Vreth Dominion has spent 400 years building power, and in those 400 years has never once considered what it would mean to be worth knowing. We built fleets. We built frameworks. We built the architecture of compulsion and called it civilization. Humanity built none of these things. Or rather, they built them slowly, partially, imperfectly, alongside something else, a habit of reaching toward things they couldn't guarantee would reach back. A habit of deciding in the absence of certainty that the act of reaching mattered in itself. I do not know if this makes them stronger than us. I do not know if strength is the right measure. What I know is this. The fleet reached the edge of the Carrack system and received a survey of a debris field from a species that had every reason to let the fleet fly blind through it. And instead of using the debris as a weapon, they mapped it. Perfectly. They gave us the map. I spent a long time trying to understand the strategy behind that. I kept asking myself what they were trying to accomplish. I think now that I was asking the wrong question. I think they weren't trying to accomplish anything. I think they simply decided that if there was going to be a conversation, it should start with honesty, even if honesty was dangerous, even if the fleet might use the map to come faster, even if none of it worked in the end. They gave us the map because they had decided without guarantee that we were worth telling the truth to. In 400 years, no civilization has ever done that for the Dominion. I am not sure we knew before this what we had been missing. I am not sure we know now. But I find that I cannot stop thinking about it, about a species that should have been afraid and was not because they had already done the harder thing, the thing you do before the fear arrives, before the ships appear on the edge of your sky, before anyone asks you to be brave. They had already decided what they were, and they had decided it would cost what it cost. And they built their relay anyway and sent their stories anyway and held their empty chairs anyway and played their music in corridors where no one was listening, and waited, and waited, and the galaxy slowly began to listen back.